Toxic metals, a plague on human health in most industrialized countries. We're going to be doing a deeper dive tonight into this very topic. Stay tuned. You unlock this door with the key of compassion. Beyond it is another world, a world of science, a world of common sense, a world of sanity. You're moving into a land of both empathy and ethics, of nutritional knowledge and empowerment. You've just crossed over into Dr. Osborne's zone. Toxic metals, what are they? What do they do to your health? Tonight we're going to be talking about the most common toxic metals that you should be concerned about. We're going to be talking about where they come from, how you get exposure. We're going to be diving into their symptoms, what types of problems they can create, but also we're going to be talking about solutions. How can you protect yourself from getting exposure? And if you have exposure, what should you be thinking about doing to overcome the poisoning of these substances? So let's dive into where heavy metals actually come from. How are we getting exposure? So we have different mechanisms of exposure, but industrial pollutants, and common example here is coal burning can put out different types of metals. We have mining industry. We have the agricultural industry. A lot of your pesticides and insecticides are contaminated, are produced with heavy metals. And then we have urban exposure. An classic example of this, for those of you who remember Flint, Michigan, where the infrastructure of this town, the pipes were lined or had lead that was leaching into the water supply, causing many folks in that city to become sick. So we've got all these potential areas where we're using metals in different processes. We use metals in things like generating batteries and computer parts, so they end up in our groundwater, and that's what this is referring to, is from all of these potential ways we can have exposure to metals. It's generally the technology generates a groundwater runoff, and so we end up with these metals being found in our rivers, in our lakes, in our bodies of water. And so then we get biological and chemical transformation of these metals, and so many of them are from the water, go into the sediment, into the soil, find their way into the plants, and then from the plants find their way into the actual animals through consumption. And so this cycle of heavy metal exposure can go on. And so we get the byproducts of industry into our water and into our soil. And again, many of our plants are designed to grow in that very same soil that's being contaminated with these metals, and so it ends up in our food supply as well. So our exposure is pretty ubiquitous at this point. If you live in a modern civilized area of the world, your exposure to toxic metals is pretty much an imminent thing. It's something that you're going to want to be concerned about, and that you're going to want to do as much to protect yourself as you possibly can. And we'll talk about some of those mechanisms of protection here shortly. Now, why should we be concerned about heavy metals? What's the danger in being exposed? Well, let's take a look at this diagram again from the same research review on the topic, but you can see here at the top, heavy metals can impact a number of different systems in the body. We have impact on the nervous system. A lot of the side effects of heavy metals actually impact or affect the brain and the nerves or neurotransmitter production, leading to neurotoxicity. And we'll dive into some of those symptoms here shortly. We also have heavy metals that can actually impact your kidneys. And so we get this, what's called nephrotoxicity, right? So damage to the kidneys directly. Perfect example, lead is very nephrotoxic. We have the hepatotoxicity. This refers to the liver. The hepatotoxicity, again, to the liver. So for those of you, who maybe didn't take biology or anatomy and physiology, hepato refers to liver, nephro refers to kidney. And then over here on this side of the equation, we have carcinogenesis. This is cancer, right? So these are carcinogens. They can drive the process of cancer by driving the process of oxidative stress. Oxidative stress, if you've heard the term free radicals, many of these metals behave and act as free radicals, leading to, again, oxidative stress that can create or potentiate cancer. We also have cardiovascular or heart toxicity. And this has to do with metals interfering with a number of the different chemicals that help regulate vasoconstriction and vasodilation of the arteries in the blood system or in the circulatory system. And so this can lead to things like high blood pressure. Again, another example we see is lead toxicity having the capacity to do this. Some of the metals actually interfere, like cadmium and lead. And arsenic can actually interfere with calcium and magnesium and potassium and their functions. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons metals are toxic is because of that. And it's not listed on this diagram, but they actually compete for binding sites from other minerals. So binding of magnesium and calcium and zinc. And so what happens to a lot of people is when they're exposed chronically to heavy metals, these metals will interfere with the binding sites of these other minerals, leading to the symptoms of deficiency of those minerals. And so you add that to all these other potential impacts and effects. We also have metal affecting the skin, so we can get skin toxicity. A lot of the symptoms of metal exposure occur as inflammatory skin disorder. And then we can also get immunological toxicity. So this has to do with immunological, meaning the immune system. So an overreactive immune system. This is actually one of the triggers for autoimmune disease. So if you ever heard me talk about the 4 primary drivers or primary triggers of autoimmune processes, food, chemicals, microbial imbalance, and number 4 is nutritional deficit. Well, heavy metals fit the bill of the chemical category. We consider these toxic chemicals. So as a driver, as a category, they drive autoimmune disease, but they also drive it nutritionally because they interfere with nutrients doing their job. Okay, so we also know that metals can affect the reproductive system. So metals can impact fertility, both in men and in women. You can see here, decreased testosterone in men and decreased spermatogenesis. So can be a very big problem in terms of fertility. And then we have genotoxicity. We know metals can actually do damage to DNA. So DNA strand breaks leads to damage to the genome, which makes it harder for cells to heal and replicate and maintain themselves, and we can get an increased risk for many problems. Again, cancer, this and this go kind of hand in hand, because genotoxicity can contribute to or increase the risk for developing carcinogenic problems or cancer-based problems as well. So these are kind of categorically the different systems that we know heavy metals can actually impact. Now, I want to make a clear distinction with heavy metal because there's kind of 2 ways people get exposed. There's heavy metal from an acute perspective, meaning you were exposed to massive quantities in a very short period of time, and you actually are suffering with an acute poisoning. Now, an acute poisoning of heavy metals can kill you. They can be terminal, acute poisoning. And what I'm really referring to here tonight with you are not those that suffer from acute poisoning who got mass exposure. We're talking about what's known as a term. There's a term in research and science that's oftentimes used, and that term is bioaccumulation. Okay, meaning it's the slow dose which accumulates in your tissue or tissues over time. So think of heavy metal, as we're talking about it tonight, as a slow poison, not a fast-acting poison. And so this is where you could be getting low levels or low-dose exposure over many, many years. As a matter of fact, the baby boomer generation of our time, we call that generation, the lead generation, because they were exposed to lead in things like paint. Remember, the old paint contained lead as a pigment. They were exposed to lead in the gasoline. If you were born before 1975-ish, you may remember that there was actually leaded gasoline and unleaded gasoline as options to purchase. And that's because they would put lead in the gasoline because of its effect on the engine. And so again, paint, gasoline, we would find lead in toys, children's toys. We'd find lead in pipes, as solder for the pipes to put the pipes together. Not so much lead pipes per se, but the solder that held the pipes together. Oftentimes it was a lead derivative. So you had a lot of lead exposure in that generation. And so nobody, now I shouldn't say nobody, but it was not super common to see acute lead poisoning in somebody unless you had like a child who was eating paint off of a wall or chipping away at some painted toy that was getting really a high level of exposure and developed an acute toxicity poisoning. But the vast majority of that generation bioaccumulated the lead or bioaccumulated their exposure to metal over time. So it's important to make that distinction because you don't just wake up from bioaccumulation problems. This is a slow burn. It's a slow poison. So keep that in mind as we go through this today. So here's some of the most common toxic metals that we see. I'm not going to go through every single toxic metal. We just don't have the time or bandwidth to cover all of it. But these are some of the most common ones that I see in people that we actually test for heavy metal exposure or heavy metal bioaccumulation. Mercury, so Hg is mercury. And then we have lead here, Pb, and then aluminum, cadmium, and thallium. That's an A. So these metals are some of the most common ones that we'll see in people today that come in and get actually testing done. And so to give you an idea for where these exposures are commonly coming from with mercury, a lot of it is seafood, and it's not all seafood, so I don't want to say don't ever eat seafood, but it's the bigger the fish, the more the potential for exposure. So the bigger the fish, the greater potential for quantity. Now, some companies do mercury testing on their seafood, and I would say if you're in the market and you really like seafood or you're trying to follow a diet with a higher seafood quantity, go for smaller fish like anchovies and sardines. The smaller the fish, the less bioaccumulation of the metal from the ocean water runoff that they have. The bigger the fish, the more potential. So tuna would be a higher mercury containing fish. Salmon potentially higher in mercury. But don't necessarily need to avoid seafood per se, but just be aware, again, that can be a source of exposure. We also have dental amalgams. Now this is becoming less true with the advancement of time. And what I mean by that is a lot of the original amalgams, the silver amalgams, or silver fillings, if you will, had mercury in them. And so if you've had, again, if you were born kind of 1970s or even prior, the likelihood that when you went to the dentist that your cavities would have been filled with a silver filling versus, say, today that you make them out of different types of composite materials, the likelihood that you had mercury put in your mouth is very high. So if you open your mouth, an easy way to know this, open your mouth, look in the mirror. If you've got a bunch of kind of dark fillings in your teeth, then those are silver amalgams and there's probably mercury in them. And the problem with those is that they can slowly expose you to mercury as you chew, as you break those fillings down. Now the reason dentists used silver fillings is because they're really super stable and they sealed cavities really, really well. So from a materials perspective, they did a fantastic job. And a lot of these fillings, even if you have them, they may be stable. I would say not every silver filling absolutely needs to be emergency-based removed tomorrow. So if you're looking at that and you've got some silver fillings and you're like, should I or should I not have them removed? My advice to anyone who's got silver fillings in their mouth is first, before you just go and remove them, test your body to make sure that mercury is even a problem for you, because if it's not, it may not be something that you prioritize first as a first line of something you need to go run out and can get really costly. I mean, you can spend thousands of dollars having silver amalgams removed. Plus, you need, if you're going to do it, you need to find a good biological dentist who's well versed in the proper removal of those amalgams. Because a lot of times, what happens is they pull. They pull them out, but they don't protect you as they're pulling them out. Remember, silver amalgams are caustic, and so once they break into them and crack them open, you can now be exposed to, or accidentally swallow a bulk dose of mercury, and that can make you sick. I've actually seen this happen to people where they worked with a dentist who didn't protect them properly during the removal. So make sure you work with a biological dentist if you're going to go and get these removed. Or at the very least, work with a dentist, even if they're not registered with biological dentist associations. Make sure they had a special training to properly remove or safely remove mercury amalgams or silver amalgams. Then the other place that we get it is shots. Now, this has somewhat changed in the past few years, where mercury used to be in like the flu shots that were given, and a number of others, MMR and some of the others, but they've gone and replaced a lot of the shots that used to contain mercury, and then they've gone and replaced some of that with aluminum. So now, you can check the inactive ingredient list on any of these and kind of see which ones contain, but just be aware this is another one of the places where people get exposure. It's one of the reasons why right now scientists are starting to question a lot of those generalized recommendations that have been put in place over the years, because this is actually one of the reasons, are these heavy metal contaminants that are actually used on purpose in those. They're used as adjuvant agents to help stimulate the immune system. And so again, many people, especially genetically susceptible individuals, can overreact to some of these, and this is why you can see some people getting injured. Not everyone does, but many people we have seen over the years as a result of heavy metal contaminants. And then we have lead. Lead, where do most people get their exposure today? Predominantly water. And this is like the city water supply, depending on the age of the city's infrastructure where you're at. Again, I use Flint, Michigan as the example there of an infrastructure that was lead contaminated. We also see, a lot of things that are made in China. And this is not just like pots, pans, cups and other things. This could also be food. So food, food products, baby formula, perfect example. We've seen recalls of lead and baby cereals, recalls because of lead toxicity or an abundance of lead. So beware, made in China. You want to really be cautious, because there's a reason why a lot of companies have outsourced their businesses overseas. It's because there's less EPA oversight. When you go and do business where there's less oversight and you can import those products back into the country, there's just not the same oversight that you would have if those people had their factories over here. So a lot of companies skirt the oversight, produce in China, and bring back cheaper products that are contaminated with metal. So my advice is, if you're looking at food, don't buy made in China. If you're looking at pots and pans and other things that have the potential to be contaminated with metal, it's better off buy U.S., buy American made, or buy European made, but avoid, in my opinion, avoid this if you want to avoid lead. And then the last reason why we'll see lead, very common, has to do with the bioaccumulation. And I was talking about this a moment ago. This is the chronic exposure of low doses of lead, because historically as a nation we've used it in paints and gasoline and as additives and other things, and so we've got this bioaccumulation that's occurred. I think it's important to say too that lead is one of the heavy metals that crosses the placenta. So if you are a pregnant mother and you are being exposed to lead, your baby is then going to be exposed to that lead, because lead can cross the placenta and it can make your baby exposed, and that can then start to accumulate even in utero in your baby. So you want to be aware and you want to be cautious that you're doing everything you can to avoid exposure during pregnancy, ladies. And so again, it crosses the placenta, so you got to watch out. And then we have aluminum, and aluminum is used, the classic is foil, right? So aluminum foil, a lot of people used to cook or bake with, but you also have tin cans and other forms of cookware that are aluminum based. And so again, high quality cast iron, high quality stainless steel would be better options in my opinion if we're talking about aluminum free types of cookware. Again, don't drink out of tin cans. I mean, a lot of people do. I don't recommend it. Try to avoid that, and try to avoid, having your food cooked directly on the foil. If you're wrapping a lid with foil and it's not actually touching or permeating your food, you're probably better off or okay, but cooking directly on the foil, I would be cautious about that for that exposure to aluminum. So we have cadmium. Cadmium oftentimes found in the water. A lot of the batteries being produced today are cadmium based, the dicad batteries, and so those batteries, they bury them, they put them in the ground, and where do they end up? They end up in groundwater, as well as soil as they break down. We also see a lot of cadmium in contaminated foods. It's a big one that we see. Cadmium also found, a lot of it, if you're a smoker, this is a good reason to add, smoking cessation to your resolution list of improving your health. But smoking can increase you to massive quantities of cadmium over your lifetime, or cadmium contamination. So what foods are richest or highest in cadmium potential problems? It would be rice. And this is one of the reasons why, when I wrote No Grain, No Pain, heavy metals was one of the reasons to avoid all grains, not just wheat, barley, and rye, because, a lot of your foods that are high or a lot of your rice-based foods, I should say, are high in cadmium, also high in lead. We get rice can be contaminated with arsenic, which is not on this top 5 list, but we could put it as a bonus. We could put arsenic on here, and we could also say, rice being one of the biggest sources of chronic bioaccumulative exposure, because a lot of arsenic is used to make pesticides, which then end up in the soil, and so then when we're growing those foods, we're getting exposure to that, because those foods, especially rice, is really good at this. It pulls arsenic and cadmium and lead out of the soil into itself, and then when we go to eat those things as staple foods and feed our babies, rice cereals and other things, we're exposing them to high levels of these compounds early in life, and that's no good, because remember, what did we say earlier? The impact and the effect is multisystemic, right? Nervous system, kidneys, liver, potential for cancer, heart, skin, immune system, genetic issues, all can occur. So obviously you don't want your babies being exposed to high levels of these contaminated foods. And the last one over here on the right is thallium. And thallium is a toxic metal. A lot of where we get today's exposure, where I see it, at least clinically speaking, is people that, and again, I'm not picking on you if you are following a plant-based diet or a vegetarian diet, but where do we get a lot of kale from environmentally, or not kale, where do we get a lot of thallium from environmentally? It's from kale. Kale's a superfood. We always hear that. Kale's this really, really healthy food that you should eat a lot of. Well, the problem that we're finding is that kale is super at detoxing the soil. Kale can detox soil very well. And so one of the things that we find in soil is thallium, because of this right here, because of the coal ash. One of the things that happens in the organic farming industry is they actually take a lot of coal ash, which is a byproduct of burning coal as fuel, and they sell that to the organic farming industry, and they use that as a soil amendment, if you will, to improve the soil. But that burn-off comes with a lot of thallium, so you end up with thallium in that soil. And if you're growing your organic kale in that particular soil, that kale super detoxifies the soil, pulls the thallium into it. So if you're doing heavy kale consumption, and I see this a lot in juicers, not just plant-based diet folks, but people who do a ton of juicing where they're using kale as a primary source of that green juice, but we're seeing them come back super high in thallium, and it can make you sick. So be careful. Now, one of the other places that we see people having higher risks of heavy metals is people following gluten-free diets. And I put this up here. This was a review paper published in Clinics in Gastroenterology and Hepatology. And so what you can see, the title, Accumulation of Heavy Metals in People on a Gluten-Free Diet. And so with this data identified is that people following a gluten-free diet had significant higher urine levels of total. So again, what's key here, because a lot of studies are what we call epidemiological studies. And epidemiological studies are like, oftentimes they're population-based surveys. So there's surveys a lot of times where they're asking people about things. This study was not a survey, it was actually an analysis where they measured output of the urine. So this is actually testing that found higher levels of arsenic and then blood, higher level of urine arsenic. So urine arsenic coming out in the urine, and then higher levels of blood, mercury, lead, and cadmium than persons not avoiding gluten. So why is this happening? I can tell you what we suspect. Although these authors, didn't go on to conclusively say why people following a gluten-free diet are exposed to more of these heavy metals. But the biggest reasons are, and we found this to be true, is that wheat as a food has higher levels of, rice as a food has higher levels of arsenic, of lead, and of cadmium. And so a lot of people following a gluten-free diet, what do? They gravitate toward this high consumption of rice because it's one of their favorite substitutes to make breads, pastas, cakes, and do baking with is rice. And then the other one is corn. They increase their corn. And so what they've identified with corn and corn byproducts is more mercury exposure. So we know that corn and rice, of all of the types of grains, have more toxic heavy metals in them than the other grains. And so again, somebody going on this traditional gluten-free diet where they're avoiding wheat, barley, and rye, but increasing their rice and corn, are exposing themselves to more dietary sources of these toxic heavy metals. And this is just one more reason why you probably heard me differentiate, when I say no grain, no pain, the title of my book, the title wasn't no gluten, no pain, it was no grain, no pain. And this is one of the reasons why, is the contamination of corn and rice with high levels of heavy metals that bioaccumulate in the tissues, leading to kidney and liver and heart and skin and all other types of potential damage. A lot of the symptoms, unfortunately, of celiac, like classic celiac disease, where you have the GI tract inflammation, and we got increases of inflammation. You can have increased malabsorption, so vitamin mineral deficiencies. And the problem, one of the biggest problems with somebody who's got like a gluten sensitivity, not just celiac, but also non-celiac gluten sensitive individuals, is these are very big problems for them. And what happens is this malabsorption will affect things like calcium and magnesium and zinc and copper and selenium. These are all very important minerals. And what's been shown in research is that when people develop, or when people have deficiencies of these particular minerals, then if they are exposed to heavy metals like mercury, lead, cadmium, and arsenic, then these metals will actually have a more profound effect. In other words, people with poor mineral status are more impacted by heavy metals. They can actually become toxic more easily. In other words, healthy mineral status protects us, in a sense, from over-accumulating toxic metals. Because remember, these metals compete with these metals for binding sites. This includes in the intestine for absorption. And so if you are malabsorbed here, you can pick up more of these things, especially, again, remember, if you're a newly diagnosed gluten-sensitive individual or celiac individual, you probably already have some deficiencies in these minerals, and so you are at more risk for developing toxicity of these toxic metals. And if you just jump on a diet that's high in rice and corn, you're going to increase your exposure to those things at a pivotal point where you're most susceptible. So you have to be careful. Is why I put this up here, because I know a lot of you that follow and that watch us are actual gluten-sensitive individuals that need to understand that's a potential problem for you. Okay, let's talk about the toxicity symptoms of some of these metals. So if we're looking at mercury, can cause nerve damage. And I've seen this a lot where people develop neuropathy, and I've seen it multiple ways. So we see like peripheral neuropathy, which would be something like numbness and tingling of the hands and feet. So we got to be careful with mercury, because I mean, a lot of times people get a diagnosis of, peripheral neuropathy. The doctors a lot of times don't even measure for mercury. Some doctors will say, oh, well, it's carpal tunnel syndrome, or you have diabetic neuropathy because maybe they have some other disease complications. But looking for mercury is in my experience anyway, doctors very rarely actually look at it. But peripheral neuropathy is a very common manifestation. Burning mouth. If you've ever felt like your mouth was scalding, like your tongue felt like it was being scalded by burning hot water, or if you had a metallic taste, that's another one here. So metallic taste in your mouth, this can be a symptom of mercury. And then brain fog is a big one. Brain fog. I actually had a case one time as a woman who had her problem was her silver amalgams. They were leaching mercury through her cheeks into her bloodstream. So every time she would eat, she was just slowly poisoning herself with her dental amalgams, and she got to such a level where she couldn't remember her daughter's name. Like, her level of memory loss was bordered on late stage dementia. And when we finally identified her levels of mercury were sky high, and of course historically she had the silver amalgams, and so we sent her to a dentist, and she had her amalgams removed. Again, silver amalgams came out, and she made a full recovery, right? And that's the power of understanding. That's the power of knowing, okay, what the symptoms are. Because if you relate to these symptoms, and you've done every other test, and you've looked at every other thing, and your diet is crystal clean, and beyond that, this matches you, and you've got silver amalgams, you may want to go have that conversation with a dentist. We also have lead. Lead, as I mentioned earlier, kidney damage is a major problem with lead. So, one of the tests, simple things that you can ask, if you've got chronic kidney disease, CKD, oftentimes abbreviated CKD, chronic kidney disease, one of the things that, but your doctor will kind of monitor or measure is something called your GFR. GFR stands for glomerular filtration rate. A lot of doctors, they'll do your blood work, they'll also measure creatinine, and they'll measure your blood urea nitrogen or your bun, but GFR is a calculation. And if your GFR, typically if it's less than 60, so if it's below 60, then generally speaking, they're going to call that some degree of kidney disease or chronic kidney disease or kidney failure. And this is something that's commonly seen in people with a historical again, lead accumulation, because remember what I said earlier, lead bioaccumulates slowly, and especially if you grow up in the lead age. Now we'll see lead also contributes to bone loss. It actually makes your bones more brittle and makes them less dense, and that's part of the reason why is it displaces calcium and zinc and magnesium from properly penetrating into the collagen matrix of bone and mineralizing it. So the other thing that we see a lot of times with lead toxicity is people that have calcium and magnesium deficiency and deficiency symptoms. And so what does that look like? That very commonly looks like cramping in the muscles, toe and foot cramping, calf cramping at night can be symptoms. Spasms, eyelid twitches, shoulder twitches, just involuntary motor spasms or muscle spasms are very, very common manifestation of calcium and magnesium deficiency. So if you've got that, don't know why, your diet's good, your nutrition's good, again, you might want to have your levels of lead looked at, especially if you've got also unexplainable chronic kidney issues and don't know why. Let's move on to aluminum. Aluminum's a big one that impacts and affects the brain. So we get dementia, memory loss, long-term, earlier term, or shorter term. We get brain fog, neurological inflammation, and this can sometimes be found, on an MRI. Now, there's a special type of MRI that's better at diagnosing brain inflammation than like a standard MRI, and that, if you're talking with your doctor, you might just talk to them about this technology. It's called NeuroQuant. And what that is it's a three-dimensional MRI that can actually visualize the brain a lot better to pick up on nuanced inflammation, neurological inflammation. But aluminum, very, very much it impacts or affects the brain. And we have cadmium. Cadmium, can, like lead, can cause kidney damage and bone loss. But one of the other symptoms of chronic cadmium exposure is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Things like shortness of breath or air hunger are kind of earlier warning symptoms of this. If you've been diagnosed with a type of COPD and you also have kidney disease and you've also been told that you have bone loss or osteoporosis or osteopenia, you know, check it out. Cadmium might be something that's contributing to that problem. And then we have thallium. And thallium, one of the hallmarks, actually saw a case of thallium toxicity years ago, and this was in a case where a young woman had ascending neuropathy, where the neuropathy started in the toes and it moved its way up, the legs, hence the term ascending. It's going up, it's moving its way up. As it gets worse, the problem starts low and it works its way high. She actually, by the time she made it to me, she was in a wheelchair. You know, we were able to reverse this, but thallium was playing a big part of this issue. Dizziness, you know, with unexplainable dizziness can be a symptom of thallium toxicity. Hair loss as well as dementia as well. Now, since we talked about arsenic earlier, I said we'll add it as a bonus. Let's just fill in some things with arsenic here. So arsenic can lead to a number of different problems. It's been linked to bone loss as well. But on the skin, it'll oftentimes lead to hyperpigmentation. Hyperpigmentation of the skin, of the feet, particularly Blackfoot disease, can be a manifestation of chronic arsenic exposure. Now again, difference between acute and chronic, but Blackfoot, hyperpigmentation of the skin, not uncommon to see. And then we also see with arsenic, you get a lot of nausea and GI symptoms as well. And there's a marking that can appear on the nails. And so if you look at like a fingernail, so let's just imagine that's a fingernail. Okay, and there's a little moon in the nail. But you'll get lines going across, and they'll be horizontal. Let's make them a different color. Horizontal lines kind of going across the nail. So you'll see this pattern where they're kind of growing this way, and those are called Mees lines, M-E-E-S apostrophe, Mees lines. But those will be white. I drew them as yellow because we're on a white background here. But lines like that, patternistically horizontal going across the nail beds, could also mean arsenic poisoning or arsenic toxicity as well. Okay. Let's talk about how do we avoid it. So we know what to look for, what are the symptoms, but now what do we do to avoid exposure? So the number one thing that you can do, in my opinion, everybody living in an industrialized area should be filtering air and water. You know, best types of filters, you know, my opinion, filtering the air, you want like a HEPA filter is a really good place to start. It's relatively inexpensive for most people. You can get a HEPA, you can buy them at Walmart, you can buy them, you know, at the local store for, you know, a few $100s. You know, you can actually, you know, that's if you don't have, depending on where you live in an apartment, you don't own the building, you obviously want to have a standalone filter that you can use. Now, if you own your own home, you may want to look at some more advanced filtration that you can add to your HVAC system, but this is a really good place to start. And then water, you know, if you live in the city, probably the best way to filter your water is reverse osmosis. The reason why is RO will pull out all the metals, and one, you know, carbon does good too. So you know, RO is not the only option here. You could look for a carbon, actually specifically granular activated carbon, and KDF do a good job as well. What carbon and KDF don't pull very well is they don't pull out fluoride, which we're not talking about fluoride today, although fluoride is a metalloid or a type of metal that's a toxin that's oftentimes added to water and can be problematic as well. But RO pulls fluoride, carbon and KDF will pull out a lot of the other contaminant metals, but RO does a better job all the way around. So RO, in my opinion, if you live in the city, is a great type of filtering device. Just remember, if you use RO, you want to add electrolytes back to your water. We have something called Ultra Electrolytes at Gluten-Free Society that you can check out, but it's a good idea to add electrolytes back to the water if you're going to use RO as a filtration. But filtering your air and water is going to help protect you. It's a shield to protect you from what we know is already happening. Our environments are contaminated with heavy metals, the air, the water, the soil, and that's not going to change anytime soon. I don't see all the big companies and big corporations saying, oh, we're going to stop poisoning things and quit making money. I don't see that as a realistic possibility. So we're going to continue to be exposed to these things. So the best you can do is filter. The other thing is to reduce known contaminated foods and not make them staples. Rice is probably, arguably, one of the biggest. Rice and corn, as I mentioned earlier. And there's some recent, noise about chocolate as being contaminated with some lead, and so I would say proceed with caution. I think with chocolate, nobody should be eating chocolate as a staple food anyway. And this, the case with foods is, if you're gluten sensitive, I recommend you avoid these anyway. But if you are a chocoholic, or if you're not gluten sensitive, but you just eat rice at every meal, you just need to be aware that there's a heavy potential for contamination there, and that if you're struggling in your health, you may be creating problems, or you may be contributing to those problems by using those as staple foods. Avoid cheaply made household products. You get what you pay for is that old adage, and I know with inflation and everything the way that it's going, this is easy for some to say and harder for some to do. But really, honestly, when it comes to the things that you eat off of, eat out of, or cook or prepare your foods in, prioritize those things first, because you want to reduce your potential that you're going to ingest eating or consuming heavy metals, because by ingesting them, you increase the risk of creating a problem. The other thing is a lot of your, like I said, eating and drinking and cooking, invest in glass. Glass is cheap, right? So this is no more of an expensive thing. But if you're drinking out of plastic cups or like cheap metal cups, again, produced in foreign countries like China and India, you run a risk of heavy metal contamination. Because there's lower standards and there's lower restrictions, environmental restrictions. If we look at, environmental pollutants produced, per capita, China and India are at the top of the list. The U.S. is very low down on that list because we have really pretty good environmental restrictions and standards, and we're actually less polluted today than we were in the 70s because of those restrictions. But again, a lot of our manufacturing has gone overseas, and so we're just bringing this poison back to us. So try to avoid that. Some things that you can do. So one of the things that these authors did, in this particular paper was, and this was just published in 2022, is they kind of accumulated all the different types of things that you could do, whether it was through your diet or through different types of medications. They were trying to summarize how you could offset the different toxicities that came from different heavy metals. And their concern was that because there's a way that in medicine, heavy metals are actually, oftentimes they're treated through something called IV chelation. Some people want to pronounce it chelation because it's CH, but the CH is actually pronounced K, like chelation. And so IV chelation with substances like DMSA and DMSO are very common choices medically to pull metals out of you. So these are IV treatments. They will run these chemicals through your body, and these chemicals work as binding agents. They will bind onto toxic metals and then pull them out of you. And so doing that, though, these two compounds are not specific for bad guys. They will pull not just lead and arsenic and mercury and cadmium and thallium, but they will also pull calcium and magnesium and zinc. And so, you have to be aware that when you do IV chelation, you should also, your doctor that you're working with should have a plan where he is also remineralizing you, making sure he's adding minerals back to you to prevent mineral deficiency. Because that's one of the risks with doing IV chelation, is that you cause mineral deficits in the process of pulling out the bad stuff. You're also pulling out the good stuff. These scientists got together and said, well, how could we make nutritional recommendations or lifestyle recommendations to mitigate some of the potential poisonous effects of heavy metals? And so they came up with certain food-based items that have known protective effects. And so I would say this is more along the lines of, if you have the damage from heavy metals, these are natural things you can do with your diet or lifestyle that would allow you to negate some of the toxic effects. But again, at the end of the day, I agree that I think that chelation, you got to get the metal out of you. If you never get the metal out of you, you're stuck over here just using a bunch of supplements or food-based items to try to offset the damage. But remember, metals will bioaccumulate and stay lodged in your tissues, and you really, if you're high, you want to get them out of you. And although IV chelation is not the only option for chelation, there's nutritional chelation that can also be done that will help pull and bind a lot of those toxic metals and support your detoxification as well. But let's just talk about some of the things that can be done. I'll point a few of these out without reading the entire list to you. But like for the nephrotoxicity, so for the kidney, their recommendation, there are a few things on this list that I think are worth pointing out. One of them being alpha lipoic acid, another one being silymarin, which comes from milk thistle. So these are just things that you can do to support your body's healing and repair in terms of kidney damage caused by metals. They also mention quercetin, curcumin, right, and royal jelly as options. I like quercetin as an antioxidant bioflavonoid. It's one of my favorite to use because it's so potent and so powerful. And you can see for the carcinogenic effects, they're recommending some similar things here: curcumin and sulforaphane, which is an extract from cruciferous, like broccoli. Melatonin, which we get from sunshine. Best place to get melatonin for free is sunshine, and getting plenty of it. And then again, quercetin. Again there. And then down here you can see for the hepato or liver toxicity, curcumin, okay, and berberine and carnosine, all options here. For heart toxicity, vitamin C, sulforaphane, and curcumin. And for skin toxicity, epigallocatechin 3-gallate, which is generally, this is green tea, okay? We found in green tea. So if you're a green tea drinker and you like your green tea, that's a way to get epigallocatechin. You can get it from apples. The skin in the apples contain that same substance as well. And then immunological toxicity, myo-inositol, which is a B vitamin compound, and then curcumin. Again, you see curcumin on a lot of these. And then for reproductive toxicity, ellagic acid, which is found in things like pomegranates and strawberries and some nuts. And then up here for genotoxicity, you can see again epigallocatechin, and then curcumin and silymarin. And then for the neurotoxicity, again, curcumin. So you see, if you're trying to hit all the right notes with all these things, I think a really good walkaway would be turmeric, right? Curcumin. As a potential to give you some benefit of protection and support in terms of heavy metal toxicity. But I'm more of a fan of, what do you do in the long haul? What do you need to do long term? You got to get the metal out of you. You just can't let it stay in you. And getting it out of you is how do we detox, right? What can you do? Well, one of the things that you can do is work with a good functional healthcare provider and do a process of chelation. And I recommend, if you're going to do that, you work with somebody who knows what they're doing and can really help you. But what you can do is you can make better decisions that help support detoxification pathways. So how do you do it? How do you make this how do you help yourself protect yourself from heavy metals and help to get heavy metal out of you naturally? How do you support your body's ability to do that? Well, let's talk about that. Because there's different primary pathways for detoxification. And number one is poop, right? We have bowel movements, so we poop it out. And there's a process whereby our liver helps us to excrete toxins and poisons into the GI tract, and we can poop those out. So, the enemy of detoxification is the opposite of pooping regularly, which is constipation. So if you are constipated, this is, you're blocking one of your primary channels of detoxification. And so focus on making sure that you're doing everything to have healthy, regular bowel movements. Now, I've done an entire show on constipation that you can go through and you can watch. You just type that in on my channel and you'll pull that up if you want to dive deeper into that. Number 2 is sweating. We get rid of a lot of toxins through the skin itself. That's why a lot of the symptoms of heavy metal toxicity as they're coming out through the sweat can be inflammation of the skin. So sweating on a regular basis, well, you can do that with exercise. Now, some people, often talk about saunas, and one of my favorite types of sauna is infrared, because it goes deep. That light penetrance goes deep into the skin and can really pull toxins out and support that. So infrared sauna being a good way to sweat, exercise, in my opinion, being one of the freest ways and cheapest ways to sweat. Sunshine. Going out on a hot day and being exposed to sun, sunshine is one of the freest detoxification agents that you could expose yourself to on a regular basis. And the sunshine, the distinction being get good adequate sun without burning. Don't go out so long enough to burn. And then number 3 is we pee it out. So urination is one way that we get it out. And this is where, like, eating the right foods that act as, there are a number of different natural things that act as binding agents to heavy metals. And so, having these as a regular course of your diet, one of them is foods rich in alpha lipoic acid. And there are a number of foods that contain lipoic acid, but also in addition, is foods that are rich in NAC, N-acetylcysteine. These are sulfur-containing foods, so cruciferous vegetables would be an example there. Eggs would be an example there. But consuming foods that are high in nutrients that we know have binding agent properties or detoxification properties to help your liver, basically metabolize these things into water-soluble agents that can be excreted out of the urine. And then the 4th way is through breathing. A lot of people forget about breath work and breathing as being important for health, but your lungs have just a very, very powerful antioxidant system that is designed not only to prevent chemicals that we breathe in from damaging them, but also from allowing us to expel chemicals as they're being metabolized through in our bloodstream and then find their way back to the lungs. So deep breathing can be a very, very valuable tool in a detoxification protocol. So don't forget to breathe. So these things you can do, pretty much all these things here are free for the most part because they're just choices that you get to make every day. Now beyond that, if you're working with a good functional practitioner, the key message I can give you is right here. Test, don't guess. I get a lot of times where people will say, yeah, my doctor wanted to do chelation, and they never even did a test to see if they needed to do chelation. Remember that testing gives you the knowledge and the confidence to know you're doing the right thing. And so what kind of testing is best for heavy metals? In my opinion, and there are different opinions out there, I'm going to share mine with you. The best way to test for toxic chronic bioaccumulation of heavy metals is this right here. It's called a pre-post provocation test. And this is where it's a urine test. And so you give a urine sample, that's pre. So the first thing you do is collect urine, and then you take chelating agents. Again, chelation. Chelating agents. One really good one that's over the counter that many people take is something called EDTA, which is a natural chelating agent. Mix that with some NAC and some alpha lipoic acid and some garlic, and you've got a heck of a chelating oral pill that would suffice for the second part of this test, which is the post, which is where you take a dose of these things and then you collect urine for several hours, and then you're measuring to see what kind of heavy metals are coming out. This again, pre and post provocation. The pills that contain these types of substances are the provoking agents, or what are called provoking agents. And so if you're working with a healthcare provider, they'll know what that means, and they'll know and probably will have an idea of what they would want to use to test you. So test, don't guess. Now, serum testing, a lot of people bring this to me and they say, yeah, my doctor tested me for mercury or my doctor tested me for lead, and they bring back a serum test. And serum tests are really only accurate if you've had an acute poisoning. They're not real super accurate because your body will take the metals that you're slowly exposed to and it stores it into your tissues to get it out of the circulation. It doesn't want it in the circulation because metals are reactive and toxic. So your body will store it in tissue to get it out of the circulation, from preventing it from creating a reaction. And so serum testing is only accurate when you have an acute poisoned exposure. So if you suspect somebody's trying to kill you, you've ever watched these criminal shows on TV late at night where the husband's maybe trying to kill the wife with arsenic or something like that, then maybe serum testing might be a kind of a more accurate way for you to get that answer. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to understand about bioaccumulation, pre and post urine provocation testing is hands down one of the best ways to investigate for heavy metal toxicity, in my experience and in my opinion. So test, don't guess, and then work with that expert. Now, if you're just looking for some natural detoxification support, one of the things I created is a formula called Ultra Metal Detox. And so what this does is it just helps with liver detoxification. It helps your liver, supports your liver in doing that. It helps with kidney function. And it also contains, instead of just pulling, remember I said that any kind of chelating agent doesn't select for good or bad metals, it just pulls metal. But this formula has something in it called shilajit, which is a very, very mineral-dense substance designed to help support remineralization of the body if you're doing any type of chelation. Now, if you're doing something like this, it's more for support. You just want to be cautious. You don't want to just take an overabundance of it indefinitely and not ever investigate deeper. But if you are just trying to take a supplement that supports your ability to detox metals, it's something you can take 1 to 2 capsules of a day, and it's just part of your support program. But at the end of the day, it's always best to test, not to guess. If you suspect you've got a heavy metal issue, you need to probably get in and work with a good functional doc or somebody well-versed in this stuff to get the help that you need so that you're not just wondering or trying things that may not be helpful for you in the long run. Thanks for tuning in to the Dr. Osborne Zone. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe for more content like this, and make sure you come back next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time and Thursday at noon 30 for more episodes. Did you know that research shows that heavy grain and gluten consumption can contribute to high tissue levels of heavy metals like mercury, arsenic, lead, and cadmium? That's why I designed Ultra Metal Detox. Ultra Metal Detox is a premium gluten-free formula containing ingredients to help the body eliminate toxic oxidative metals. It contains a unique blend of nutrients that support mineral balance, antioxidant function, and detoxification. What makes this formulation so unique? Ultra Metal Detox contains Himalayan shilajit. It's an extract. This key ingredient is a fulvic acid mineral, rich resin known for its strength and energy promoting properties. It also contains a rich amount of essential minerals to support overall balance while detoxifying. This formula also contains EDTA, an amino acid compound used to support detoxification of metals largely in the gastrointestinal tract. It contains the plant power of chlorella, a naturally occurring microalgae and excellent source of chlorophyll believed to bind toxic metals. Additional ingredients include NAC, lipoic acid, and allicin. This trio of natural compounds is rich in antioxidants known to help protect the body from the oxidizing effects of toxic heavy metals. Now, as a suggested use for daily maintenance, take 2 capsules daily with food. For enhanced performance, 2 capsules twice a day in divided doses with food. And for intense detoxification, take up to 6 capsules a day in divided doses with food. It's important to work with your healthcare provider to monitor you should you embark on an intense detox protocol. So keep that in mind before trying that higher dose.